the pub began spiraling toward the earth. Shortly after the bomber spun through 10,000 feet, its spiral broke into a nosedive. Now, at low altitude, the cockpit began to flow with oxygen-rich air. Charlie regained consciousness and saw the German landscape about a mile below. He strained for the controls, dug his heels into the rudder pedals, and pulled back on the yoke with all his might. At 3,000 feet, the pub stopped diving, something no B-17 missing most of its left stabilizer should be able to do. Passing beneath 2,000 feet, after falling almost 5 miles, the bomber's wings miraculously began flying again. But the plane was still dropping. Just when Charlie was sure the pub was going to hit the ground, her nose lifted to the horizon and she leveled out. Now, Charlie asked his navigator to figure out where they were and establish a course for home. He asked another crew member for a damage report. He was told the left stabilizer was all but gone, the hydraulics were bleeding from the wings, that there were holes in the fuselage big enough to climb through, and of course that the nose and tail gunner positions were open to the sky. Only one of the 11 guns on board was operational. Perhaps because of all the confusion, the navigator mistakenly charted a course that would dodge the German town of Jeffer, but not its nearby German airfield. Now, Franz had not been one of the German pilots that had riddled the pub, but had been taking on other bombers nearby, Downing 1. He dropped into the Jeffer airfield for more fuel and ammunition when the mechanic informed him he had a .50 caliber slug lodged in his radiator. The mechanic strongly advised him to wait for repairs, which would take him out of fighting for the rest of the day. Franz refused. He heard the pub before he saw it. In fact, fast taxi down the runway in pursuit. Meanwhile, inside the pub, Charlie had given permission for his crew to bail out if they wished. He said that he hoped to fly the wounded men to England if he could make it. He left the decision on whether or not to jump again up to the crew. They decided to stick with Charlie. A short time later, Franz caught up with the bomber. He noticed again that the left stabilizer had almost been completely shot away and wondered how the bomber continued to fly. He attacked the bomber from behind, but as he approached, he noticed that the tail gunner's position had almost been completely obliterated and that the gunner was dead. His 4-foot guns pointed straight downward. He could see the gunner's blood had frozen in icicles where it had streamed down the barrels. Franz also observed through the gaping holes the fighters had punched in the fuselage, the crew huddled together caring for the wounded. Finally, he moved up about 3 feet from the pub's right wingtip and peered into the cockpit. Now, the Franz Stiegler that went to Africa to avenge his brother's death would have destroyed the bomber and killed its crew. But in the desert and over ancient Sicily, the last of Europe's knights had taught Franz a new code. Their code said to fight with fearlessness and restraint, to celebrate victories, not death, and to know when it was time to answer a higher call. He decided to spare the plane and its crew. Now, the bomber was now approaching the German flight guns along the Atlantic Wall. with Franz basically kind of flying as a wingman for him. The battery commander had watched the German fighter and the bomber flying toward them and was in a quandary as to what to do. He knew that the German Air Force had a few B-17s of their own, shot down planes that had been rebuilt to use for clandestine operations or to be used in training fighter pilots. The flight commander, of course, was not about to fire on a Messerschmitt 109 flying wing for the bomber and ordered his gunners not to fire. The two planes flew safely out over the beach and the crashing surf. Now, Franz had seen the bomber's wounds and knew the damage much, much better than the pilots. He doubted the plane's ability to make it to England. He waved to get the co-pilot's attention, pointed to the east and mouthed the word Sweden. Franz knew that neutral Sweden was just a 30-minute flight away, while the British coast was a 2-hour flight. The co-pilot just shrugged, clearly puzzled. So Franz leapfrogged the bomber and got on Charlie's side and got Charlie's attention. Again, he pointed to the word Sweden and mouthed the word Sweden, but Charlie shook his head, also clearly confused. Finally, after flying alongside each other for about 10 minutes, Franz looked at the Americans, saluted them, and then headed back to the mainland. He knew from the moment he peeled away from the bomber that he had committed a dangerous act. He had helped the enemy escape. If anyone pinned him to the act, he knew he would face a firing squad. Meanwhile, the bomber continued on and it was steadily losing altitude. The crew members eventually jettisoned everything on board, the guns, the radio, everything that wasn't nailed down out of his plane, and his injured crew were being loaded into ambulances. His first words, "What a hell of a way to start a war." Charlie and his original crew, which now included 3 replacements for the guys, killed or severely injured, went on to fly 28 missions together. After the final mission on April 11th, 1944, Charlie would smoke a cigar and drink from a bottle of whiskey, which he passed around to the crew. E.O. Puh, by the way, never dropped another bomb in Germany. Now, Franz flew more than 400 combat missions during World War II. His plane's rudder bore 27 victory marks when a .50 caliber bullet pierced his cockpit and struck him in the forehead. Miraculously, he was able to land the plane at his base and then basically passed out, blood all over his forehead and face. The ground crew opened his cockpit and dragged him out, and doctors bandaged his head and suspected possible brain damage, even though somehow the bullet had not pierced his skull. In fact, Charlie had it in his palm. He had the slug in his palm. He was able to, he was grounded, of course, immediately. And a few months later, and began jet training. He was so good at it that they made him a jet instructor. And eventually he became a jet pilot and then a senior staff officer in JV-44, the so-called Squadron of Experts. This was the squadron of the very best fighter pilots in Germany. And they were selected to fly the Me-262 jets that the Germans rolled out at the very end of the war. Franz eventually left war-torn Germany to live in Vancouver, British Columbia. He often wondered if the battered old bomber ever made it across the sea to England. Likewise, Charlie Brown had often thought about the German fighter pilot who allowed both he and his crew a chance to live. Had this ace made it through the war, and was he still alive now, 46 years later? He learned of a newsletter called Jagerblatt. It was an official publication of the Association of German Fighter Pilots. He asked the editor if he would publish his short letter describing the December 20th, 1943 incident and the German pilot he was trying to find. Charlie listed his address in Florida where he could be reached. Several months later, in January of 1990, Franz received his copy of Jagerblatt and saw Charlie's letter. He responded immediately, writing to the address. 5 days later in Florida, Charlie received Franz's letter. And Charlie was impressed because he noticed that the letter didn't ask for anything. Franz had not said, we need to write a book together and tell the world about this encounter. Franz hadn't even included his telephone number, just his address. Charlie began a letter of reply, but then he became impatient and called Vancouver Information and asked if they had a listing for a Franz Stiegler. Did, and gave him Franz's number. When Charlie called, Franz answered. Charlie said, "Franz, I think we go way back. This is Charlie Brown." The conversation was strange and awkward at first, as you might imagine. Charlie asked Franz a series of questions to figure out if he was really the pilot who spared his crew and him. Franz described the bomber's battle damage. He mentioned the missing stabilizer. He said that the rudder was nearly gone. He told Charlie the tail gunner's position was shattered. Charlie had not revealed any of these things, by the way, in his letter. Then Franz told Charlie, "When I let you go over the sea, I thought you'd never make it across." Charlie had purposely never mentioned anything in his letter about flying over the water together for a while. "My God, it is you," Charlie said. Overcome by emotion, with tears running down his cheeks, Charlie asked Franz the first thing that came to mind. "What were you pointing for? You kept pointing and trying to tell us something." "To get you to land in Sweden," Franz told Charlie. "I had no idea," Charlie said. "Otherwise, I would have flown there and would be speaking Swedish today." The two men arranged to meet in Seattle in June of 1990. Over 2 days, they revived old memories as they toured around Seattle. Charlie described it like meeting a family member he hadn't seen in 40 years. 2 months later, Franz was an invited guest at a reunion of Charlie's fighter group in Massachusetts. 2 other members of the pub's crew were there, and together with Charlie, they all owed much to Franz. Because of him, 25 children and grandchildren, the descendants of these 3 men, had a chance to live. And that's not to mention the children and grandchildren of Charlie's other crew members who were not there. Charlie's wife asked him one day if he ever found out why Franz spared him. Charlie nodded. "I was too stupid to surrender, and Franz Stiegler was too much of a gentleman to destroy us." And that's our program.